3 chilling true stories of home horror you won't believe. Say it out loud and let it sit. That's the promise here. 3 separate houses, 3 different kinds of violation, 3 normal lives that fractured in slow, quiet ways until something snapped the illusion of safety completely. I'll tell them the way they were told to me, up close in the small details, the smells and the strange silences. Listen like it's late and the lights are low. The real horror, I kept thinking as I recorded these, is how ordinary it all looked. The first one, our neighbor who wasn't. The second, a shadow seen only in a mirror. The third, someone living in the house with us. Each one started with a small, explainable thing. Music through the walls, a squeak in the stairwell, a misplaced cup, and then didn't stop. We sold one house and didn't know we were selling the keys to a mystery. We thought my teen's imagination had run away with him until a father found a man at the window. We moved into a bargain house and found someone had been using the walls for bedrooms. None of these stories end neatly. None of them make sense the way you want them to. But they happened. Here's the first. We'd bought our new place at the end of a long fall. It felt like an upgrade. More light, a porch that caught the last of the sun, a yard big enough for a dog we didn't yet have. We loved the house across the street, the one with the big maple and the sagging porch, and when the owners moved, we made the offer on both properties. They were right next to each other. People joked that we'd never have to mow more than one lawn again. We sold the smaller house to a couple who'd moved in with suitcases and polite smiles, the kind of people who seemed to arrive already knowing the rhythm of the neighborhood. At first, everything was unremarkable. Small talk over low fences, barbecues where the conversations formed and dissolved like steam, the usual creaks of old plumbing. Then came the late-night music. It started as muffled bass on the wrong side of midnight, a thump with no source. My partner and I shrugged it off. Old houses carry noise, we told ourselves. Someone had parties. Maybe their radio was too loud. Our car that had never been driven in our direction appeared with a dent. A week later, our Ring camera captured a dark figure at the front stoop at 3 in the morning, but the footage was odd. The camera angle shifted, then cut out entirely for a short stretch, and when it returned, the porch light was shattered. We assumed vandalism. We called the police. They came, took a report, and left without much more than a clipboard. The house across the street was quiet in the daylight, nothing obviously wrong. The new neighbors kept their heads down. Then the night of the burglary happened. It began like a run-of-the-mill alarm, the high animal whine of the security system, urgent and shrill. From our kitchen window we could see headlights, 2 people moving like practiced thieves, fast, efficient. They broke through a living room window, their motions savage in a way that felt staged. They acted like they'd done this before, knowing where to grab and what to load. Expensive cameras, a laptop, a few pieces of jewelry. They were gone in less than 10 minutes, carrying the sort of things that take an owner a lifetime to collect. The police arrived, neighbors gathered on porches, and the story got weirder. When officers apprehended 2 suspects nearby, both insisted in a flurry of words and gestures that they were, emphatically, the people who lived across the street. They pointed across the road with a certainty that made no sense. Their accent was wrong for the people who'd just moved in. Neither of them sounded like the man who'd been easy enough to talk to at the grocery store. They talked rapidly in a language that wasn't English, and when the officers handed over the radio to translate, those suspects used words that matched Dutch, not the accent or phrases we associated with the couple next door. The couple across the street, the ones we'd met with polite smiles, were nowhere near the scene when the suspects were taken away. Hours later, the real neighbor showed up at our porch. He was bruised, cheek swollen, lip split, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He stood in the light of our front lamp and spoke in quick, roughened sentences, refusing for a long time to let the police take a report. He said he'd been set up, hinted at debt or trouble we couldn't begin to name, and he told us something we didn't expect. He'd cheated. He wanted shelter. He asked in a way that made his voice thin and small if he could sit on our porch for a while. My partner and I were cautious. There was sadness in him, yes, but there were also things he didn't say. As the hours drew on, he left and then returned later, bleeding at the hand, clothes torn. His wife then appeared down the street, wailing in a way that made everyone hush. They argued in slurred sentences. in a private language of shame and apology, then vanished for days like they'd been erased from the neighborhood map. Days turned into a week. The wife came back alone one evening, the same face but hollower. She wouldn't talk to us at first. Police records were thin. The officers said the two men caught near the scene had given false names and had spoken languages that didn't match the couple's background, but the official trail didn't lead to a resolution we could hang our heads on. We were left with a picture in our heads that didn't fit. The couple who bought the house had seemed like paint and polite hands, and yet the men arrested that night insisted they were the same people. The real neighbor showed up bloodied and desperate, and then disappeared. The burglars spoke a language that didn't match the man who'd lived next door for months. The cameras that should have helped us were cut or manipulated at key times. We never knew if the damage to the car was part of some setup, if the staged break-in had been a cover, or if the man's confession to infidelity was simply the messy human truth hiding a darker transaction. The police did what they could within jurisdiction and evidence. There were reports, forms, and statements, but the central question, who was pretending to be whom and why, remained a blank. We stopped feeling safe in a house we'd just invested in. When someone we thought we knew turned up in a state that didn't match the versions of him we'd carried in our heads, the home felt less like shelter and more like a stage where people wore masks and slips fell off at strange hours. We double-checked locks with a ritual I hadn't known I could fall into. Every late-night knock made us jump. The porch light, which had once been a comfort, began to feel like the high beam of a theatre, showing off people who preferred to play roles instead of living honestly. The oddest part was the normalcy of it all, their register of daily life, the grocery bags, the chores, the small courtesies used as camouflage. That uncertainty sours the feeling of living next door. We still live there. The family across the street also still lives there, but the rhythm changed. Sometimes when I walk past their door, I imagine two different lives colliding in the hallway. The life you present and the life you carry in dark pockets, quietly dangerous. I learned that a neighbor's face doesn't equal understanding. I learned to pay attention to small discrepancies, to the language someone uses and the language they don't. That night changed everything. If you're finding this as unnerving as we did, consider subscribing for more true home horror. And if you've got a story like this, drop it in the comments. The second story starts in a split-level house with mirrored closet doors and a teenage voice that learned to sleep in fits and starts. My bedroom was situated between floors, one step down from the family room, one step up from the basement, so its layout always felt a little off. It had a window that looked into the backyard and mirrored sliding doors on the closet that reflected that window. When you lay in bed, you could see your own silhouette, and behind you the faint movement of the glass trees in the yard. For a long time that arrangement felt cozy. Quiet nights were punctuated by the rhythmic creak of the house, the soft breath of the furnace and the occasional truck passing on the street below. Then small things began to shred that comfort. A shuffling at night that sounded like someone rustling through leaves, the creak of shoes on the back steps. Sometimes I'd wake up with the sense of someone watching the ceiling. No noise, just a pressure. On more than one occasion I woke to the reflection in the mirrored doors, showing a shape that did not belong to the bed. It was always at the edge of sleep where the world thins and memory softens. You tell yourself it's a trick. My parents told me I had an active imagination. Friends said that mirrors do weird things when you're tired. I started to avoid looking at the window altogether, keeping the blinds almost permanently shut. But avoidance didn't stop the sound of footsteps, or the occasional breathing I could hear at the edge of silence. The pattern kept repeating for nearly a year. Small things that could be excuses, an animal running through the yard, branches scraping the glass, kept adding up to a bigger pattern that couldn't be explained away. I started sleeping with headphones and white noise, and always leaving a lamp on. My parents chalked it up to teenage anxieties, but their dismissal made it worse. When adults don't take you seriously, the fear compounds into a guilty secret. In early December, during a windstorm, the sound came again. Fierce, like someone leaning hard against the side of the house. My father, already awake because of the storm, went downstairs and looked out the back door. The backyard is fenced, and the neighbors' homes are not far. He found a man standing at my window, pressed flat to the glass as if trying to see in, his figure a muted silhouette in the storm. My father yelled and rushed out. The man scrambled and ran, vaulting over a fence with the kind of nervous energy of someone who'd been hiding there a long time. My father chased him. I remember the slam of the back door and the sound of feet on wet grass. The man disappeared over several yards, slipping into the fence line and then into a neighboring property, where officers would later tell me his path had been tracked, but ultimately lost. The police increased patrols for a few days and suggested cameras. A neighbor across the yard, the man's house that backed up to ours, reacted with an odd, defensive stance when warned. He looked at my father like the warning was misplaced, his face folding like he'd been accused of something intimate he would rather not admit. The officers were kind but blunt. They could be there more often. They could log reports, but unless they caught someone on the property with tangible evidence, it would be a pattern hard to prosecute. I switched rooms after that month of sleep without rest. I moved to a smaller room farther from the yard, tucked under a roofline that felt protective in a small, childish way. Moving rooms didn't fix the feeling that someone had watched me for months. It didn't erase the idea that I'd lied awake for a year thinking it was my imagination, while out the back, a figure might have stood and studied the pattern of my sleep. The mirror had been my portal to that vulnerability, the reflective glass that let a stranger see me without my facing him. After the storm, every time I walked past any mirrored surface, I felt the prickle I get when I realize how exposed you are. There's a strange humiliation in realizing you were right when everyone else insisted you were wrong. It's relief and shame wrapped together. I felt relief that it wasn't a dream. I felt shame that I hadn't been believed sooner. The police recommended cameras and extra lights. We complied. Nothing dramatic happened after the storm. No one came back to the same window in a way we could pin down. But for me, the house would never be the same. I'd learned the difference between being unsafe and feeling unsafe, and I carried both lessons forward. I slept better in the new room, but I never fully shrugged off the idea that someone had spent many nights just outside my view, content to be a silhouette in the glass. I suppose the worst part was the knowledge that you can be watched for months, and no one will necessarily see it until the moment you catch a glimpse yourself, or your father does. We go about daily life and assume the people outside are neighbors and not silhouettes. The ordinary turns sinister without a single flourish, just attention, repetitive and patient. The house didn't feel like a place of refuge anymore. It felt like a stage with a back row reserved for someone who didn't belong. The third story is the one that changed our sense of privacy permanently. The family in Alberta who found a small room inside their walls where someone had been living. They moved into a cheap house because it fit the budget and because it needed work, and they were excited to make it their own. New paint, new floors, a birthday dinner for a toddler, those small domestic rituals that stitch life together. After an evening of candles and cake, they came home to find the front door wide open. At first they thought someone had been in and left in a hurry. Things were shifted, a cup misplaced, drawers left ajar. But the most disturbing thing was the way the house felt watched, the parallel between an easy domesticity and the presence of something else. Small sounds followed, footsteps in the attic that weren't explained by the HVAC, a soft laugh coming from within the wall at 2 a.m, a human laugh, the kind you hear and think, who would laugh now? The sounds didn't feel random. They felt deliberate, testing the family's boundaries the way you test a fence to see if it's electrified. One night, while babysitting a newborn sister, the eldest child tuned to the baby monitor. They heard heavy padding in the hall, a hush and then a crash. On the monitor, the newborn began to cry. The babysitter's heart slammed in their chest. They grabbed what was closest, a long rifle kept for emergencies, and in the panic, realized it had no ammunition. They stood there with the weight of a symbol more than a threat, and then checked the nursery. The crib was empty. The baby monitor lay on the floor, cord trailing like a broken lifeline. Panic becomes a mechanical motion. Call, search, call again. The mother returned, frantic, and the police were called. The house was searched. Officers looked through closets, basements, and underbeds. Nothing at first. Then someone noticed that a seemingly embedded bookshelf in the family room was slightly ajar. A quick palm on one of the panels revealed a hollow. Behind that panel was a narrow, cramped room, barely large enough to sit in, but arranged as if it had been lived in. Wrappers tucked into a corner, a single cup missing its mate from the kitchen, lotion on a shelf, a small, dull pocket knife folded into the woodwork. Most chilling of all, there had been a hole, tiny, drilled through the wall, line of sight to a bed, a peephole meant for watching and not being seen. There are some things that wash over you like a wave, and don't let the shore ever be the same. Discovering that someone had created a private space inside your home where they could observe you without your knowledge is one of them. It's a betrayal of boundaries in the most intimate sense. The police treated the evidence seriously. There were photos taken, and officers moved with purposeful steps. They found traces of someone's presence: crumbs, a small blanket, a worn corner of a mattress pad. Enough to prove occupancy, not enough to give a neat narrative. No dramatic capture, no single suspect who could be pinned to a string of abuse. Just artifacts and the knowledge that for months someone had seen the family in the private hours and had the means to move unseen. The family's reaction was practical and raw. They moved to different rooms, the parents sleeping in shifts for a while, the father installing locks, and the mother making a list of things to change. But after the procedural stuff, reports, calls, neighbor watch meetings, there was the quiet, persistent fear that doing everything right didn't erase the fact that a boundary had been breached. The mother explained to me later that what kept her up at night wasn't whether the stranger had taken anything valuable. It was the sense that someone had learned how her family breathed. The crib incident could have been so much worse. The idea of someone lifting the child out of the bed wasn't a hypothetical, it was a possibility that had to be faced. People asked why they hadn't noticed before. It's a question that holds a sting of accusation, as if you could have seen more simply by wanting to. The truth is more mundane. When you move into a house, you accept cobwebs and squeaks and call some noises part of its character. Renovations hide tracks. A small room can be carved into the bones of a home in a way that obscures evidence. Some people want to be unseen. They're patient. They tuck trash into corners, reuse a toothbrush, steal the odd cup, and then they go. The police did what they could. They documented. They searched for a pattern. They spoke with neighbors. The family stayed. After counseling, after new locks, after some therapy sessions that helped but didn't erase the fact that a stranger had watched them at night. The worst aftermath is not the police forms or the locks. It's the conversation around the dinner table where the youngest says, "Are there bad people in our house?" And you have to answer honestly in a way that doesn't make your child into a prisoner of fear. You tell them you're safe now that people are working, and you try to rebuild a house that once felt ordinary. But I think the family would tell you candidly that the word home gained a measuring line now, a threshold of safety that might be crossed because of the smallest oversights. They learned to listen differently, to the squeak of the stairs, the rhythm of doors, the little repeated noises that once felt like atmosphere but suddenly required asking, why? After these 3 stories there's a pattern, but it's less tidy than you might want. It isn't that every danger came from criminals who wore ski masks or brandished weapons. Sometimes danger looks like a neighbor selling a version of himself. Sometimes it looks like a shadow in a mirror that becomes a real person. Sometimes it's someone who rents the interior of your house as a secret room. The through line is the violation of expectation, the idea that your house is where you can be unguarded and unobserved. When that's taken from you, nothing feels private anymore. There's another pattern that's harder to live with. Institutions can only do so much. The police in each story did their job to the extent evidence allowed. They took reports, they checked the camera footage, they walked the neighborhoods. But there were limits, gaps where proof didn't line up with belief, where the cameras had been tampered with, or where no one could find a suspect. The legal system needs concrete things, prints, witnesses, a clear chain of events. But terror is often built of small things, of months of minor intrusions that add up to a life shifted. It leaves you with an uneasy arithmetic. Documentation plus action may or may not equal closure. What do you do with that uncertainty? You tighten routines. You take fewer risks in the home you once gave to a sense of calm. You learn to notice the little things that before you would have let slide. You teach your children to notice, but not panic. You spend more evenings watching footage from cameras you trust, and you keep asking questions that don't always get answered. If there's a consolation in these stories, it's that attention matters. A father looking out at a storm and not ignoring the silhouette might have prevented something worse. A roommate noticing a slightly ajar bookshelf and reporting it brought a hidden life into light. Our vigilance is imperfect, and so are the systems that respond, but they matter. If there's one thing I want you to take away from these 3 separate nights of terror, it's this. Look for the small discrepancies. They're often where a larger pattern begins. Don't dismiss a persistent noise because you feel foolish. Trust, cautiously, your sense that something is off. And when the police advise you to document, do it. Cameras, logs, and neighbors are not panaceas, but they create footprints that can matter when truth is needed. I also want to say this. The people who go through these things are ordinary. They are grocery shoppers, parents, teenagers, couples trying to build comfortable lives. They stumble into situations that twist the ordinary into the uncanny. When you see a neighbor who has changed, ask early. When you feel watched, tell someone. None of this is a recipe for panic, but it is a plea for awareness. Share your own terrifying home story below, and subscribe if you want more real-life horrors. If you've lived something like this, know that you're not alone, and that telling it can be a step toward making someone else feel less foolish for listening to the small noises in their own house.